I've been reading this article by Ben Wallace in a national newspaper today. I mean, pretty extraordinary language for a former defence secretary to use about an ongoing conflict. Have you seen this sort of language being used before?
Well, Ben's pretty experienced and Ben is pretty direct, and he's saying it as he sees it. And I think he's perfectly at liberty to do that. After all, yes, he's a former Secretary of State for Defence, but he's now just a backbench MP and entitled to express his views. And to be honest, what he's saying makes really quite a lot of sense. It's a real conundrum. It's rather like the Ukraine situation. You've got negotiating positions by both parties that are mutually irreconcilable. As far as Israel is concerned, Israel has an absolute right to exist, and it's got a right to carry the fight to Hamas. Hamas, however, is sworn to want to eradicate Israel. So you've got these very difficult, contradictory positions. I think what Ben is really saying is that Hamas really must be reduced. Hamas as a threat to Israel must be eradicated, but it's got to be done in a way that the world believes is fair, is proportionate, and is being done to minimize civilian casualties. And on the evidence presented so far, it would seem that Israel's being very heavy-handed. The worst part of 18,000 Gazan citizens have been killed. And frankly, that price is too high. It's disproportionate to the suffering which Israel experienced back on the 7th of October.
I mean, Lord Dannatt, I guess what Israel would say is that they've taken all reasonable steps to reduce the number of civilian casualties, including airdropping leaflets asking people to leave the area. Isn't one of the challenges they face, though, that where you have a terrorist organisation that is waging war on a state, like we have Hamas waging war on Israel, and they are hiding amongst a civilian population, using hospitals, a baby's crib to disguise their tunnel network. Isn't it quite difficult to wage war on them without some civilian casualty, although one civilian dead is obviously one too many?
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, there are no easy solutions, and there is no way of conducting this operation without killing a number of people that in other ways you would not wish to kill. Hamas is being, as far again on all the evidence presented, is being extraordinarily deceitful in the way that it's using civilians as human shields covering their activities. It is quite incredible over the recent years how this network of tunnels has been allowed to be built. Undoubtedly, the money that's been used creating these tunnels was probably intended to create decent civil infrastructure for the people of Gaza, but has gone into constructing this tunnel network. I think what Israel has to do, and it is perfectly legitimate to continue the fight in Gaza, is to be even more careful than they currently are being, which will mean that this thing is going to take longer. And they will have to continue to resist pressure for a ceasefire, pressure to end the war. But on the other hand, what we have seen quite successfully are operational pauses, which have allowed fuel and food to get into the Gazan civilians. And that must be allowed to continue again.
Well, I don't think anyone would disagree with Lord Dannatt, but you say to carry this out in a more targeted way. I mean, what does that actually mean in practice? And of course, on the ceasefire pauses, let's not forget that in fact that was in exchange for hostages, over 100 Israelis still being held hostage. It was Hamas itself that refused to release the agreed hostages and breached the ceasefire by firing rockets into Israel. So Israel can hardly be blamed for that temporary ceasefire breaking down. In fact, they respected it. But just on your point of, a more targeted approach, how do they do that where you have a civilian city riddled with terrorist infrastructure?
Well, it goes back to the point I was making, that this will have to become a more extended operation, and the various bouts of fighting, the various attacks that the IDF carry out on targets in Gaza must be very carefully prepared, damage assessed, collateral damage assessed, and it will mean that the whole operation will take longer. They've got to make it as much as they possibly can intelligence-led, so that when they go into a building or a group of buildings, they do it based on intelligence and the likelihood that they will find a Hamas command and control center, Hamas fighters, Hamas tunnels. And this means that the operation will take longer, and they're going to have to be prepared to resist world pressure for a ceasefire.
But you know, Ben Wallace is sort of pretty much ramping up the rhetoric, as did David Cameron to some extent, around a ceasefire. I mean, I just find myself thinking about this, you know, if, as Ben Wallace says, they are losing legal authority, that's what he says in this article, I find myself thinking, at what point did we lose legal authority in Afghanistan or Iraq or indeed Northern Ireland? Surely Britain understands with her allies that where you're subject to a terrorist attack like America was in 9/11, felt that was a justification for going into both Iraq and Afghanistan, that you know, I don't really understand what he's getting to when he says they're losing legal authority. If Britain had legal authority to pursue those wars, how come Israel doesn't have authority to pursue one on its own doorstep?
I think there's a confusion between legal authority and moral authority. And I think the Israelis need to be very much aware of world opinion and who is not standing on the moral high ground. I mean, interestingly, you make a reference there to Northern Ireland. It's worth reflecting on the fact that the British Army was involved in Northern Ireland for 38 years. That was an extraordinarily long operation for which the British government needed strategic patience. The point that I'm trying to make is if the Israelis are rushing this and are going into buildings, bombing targets without proper consideration of the intelligence, then they are significantly increasing the likelihood of innocent Gazan civilians being killed. So they will have to be prepared to conduct this operation over a much longer period of time. Again, that point of strategic patience comes into it, but to make sure their actions are focused and led by intelligence, and they don't just, I'm going to say, blunder around using high explosive in a fairly indiscriminate way, which is the cause of the worst part of 18,000 civilian casualties. So no one is denying the Israelis' right to want to destroy Hamas. We're all against Hamas's desire to eradicate Israel. Israel has a perfect right since 1948 to exist as a country and to protect itself. But I think the Israelis have got to be much more careful, much more cautious, be prepared to extend this operation over a much longer period of time and do everything possible to minimize deaths of innocent Gazan civilians.